it's the final play of the semester. It's The Tempest. Oh my goodness, where to begin? Tempest. The Tempest. The play takes its name from the giant storm that starts off all of the action. The storm that brings all of the characters to Prospero's island. And I think you'll find that the play is as large and mighty as the storm from which it gets its name. We're going to try to do it justice in 2 weeks, but suffice to say, Shakespeare certainly knew how to control the box office, as it were, and write very popular plays. But he also had the genius to create plays, big dramas like this, with lasting, enduring quality. So by the time he sat down to write this in 1611, he had so much work under his belt, very near the end of his career. He managed to write this play that would be appealing to both King James and his court first, and then later to the London public, and then of course to us over 450 years later. So the result of writing this play was this big, grand, mature play with this serene outlook. I hope you enjoy the background of this slide here. I feel like it kind of, despite the very modern jacket on that dude in the middle, I think it kind of encapsulates the feeling that the play leaves me with. But yeah, that sort of serene, grand outlook, with just the right mix of fantasy and philosophy and spectacle, but also with some humor in it as well. It's filled with symbols of sin and forgiveness and repentance and salvation. All of these things are prevalent in the play. Evil is present, to be sure, but never for a moment is there, the real deep fear that its stratagems will succeed, like we see in Hamlet or like we saw in Macbeth. This sort of dark worry that things are all going to go awry. So, background. The Tempest was probably the last play that Shakespeare wrote entirely by himself before he left London to lead the life of a man of property back in Stratford. As we know, he's from Stratford. He owns a home there. He has a wife there. He has children there. So around this time is when he's packing up to go back. For this play, Shakespeare was very influenced by the current events of his day when it came to writing The Tempest. It's one of only 2 plays that have a fully original plot where he didn't borrow or take anything from other sources. We've talked about some of those as we've gone along. But anyway, at the time, there were a lot of sea voyages exploring far-off lands that brought back tales and artifacts and even native people to England. This is during the age of exploration, when countries were sending out ships and discovering the Americas, discovering the New World. And not everybody was able to leave London and go see that. In fact, the vast majority of people didn't. And so they would hear tales and they would see some of the things or hear about some of the things that were brought back by these explorers. Nobody really knew what was out there. It was this grand time of looking at the world through brand new eyes. The universe to them was becoming much larger. It's a lot like the way we look at space today. So if you are fans of any sort of outer space shows or sci-fi, that sort of stuff, that's kind of what this play was for its audience at the time, So, taking all that, basically, all of this exploration gave Shakespeare and others, the chance to write stories about new worlds, about things that might actually exist out there for explorers, for people to stumble upon. So think about, as you continue to read, and looking back on what you have read, how does the idea that all of this might be real, how would that change the way that you saw the play? As an audience member at that time, looking at this and seeing Ariel and seeing this magical, amazing creature, seeing Caliban, seeing this rugged man of the earth, you know, these sorts of creatures being real, and this sort of island being real. How does that affect your reading of the play? What elements does this, you know, share with science fiction that you might like or that you might read? So, things to keep in mind for sure, I think. Sources of the play. Sources of the play. They remain vague and dispersed, and no definite, you know, probable genesis. But he, like any artist, Shakespeare, like any artist, drew upon his own memory for many elements that went into the play, things that he'd heard, reports back from this new world I've been blabbing on about. One undeniable source is a book of pamphlets published in 1610, the year before this play, known as the Bermuda pamphlets. They describe a wreck, a shipwreck, in the Bermudas in 1609. It certainly caused a big deal of commotion and excitement in England, and there are many parallels between Shakespeare's play and the story told in the pamphlets. But like I said, it is an original plot itself. You know, he used some of the imagery of the New World and everything like that, and themes and stuff like that, but the plot is all Shakespeare. So, with all of this exploration came colonization. So the English and other European nations wanted to be sure that they had ownership over all of these discoveries, you know, all of the wealth in many forms, you know, gold, agriculture, land, etc., treasures, that sort of thing. They also felt the moral obligation to convert people to Christianity, believing that they were bringing them the gift of salvation, as well as a more civilized way of life. Of course, nowadays, looking back on colonization, we know that ultimately what happened was the decimation of people and entire cultures through deprivation and subjugation. And that's, you know, that's a horrible legacy in many, many ways. But looking from our modern eyes now, the character of Caliban, you know, what do you make of him? He's long fascinated directors, actors, audience members, because of the perspective that he offers us on colonization and even slavery. So, something to bear in mind as you read this play. I would also like to go ahead and say that as much as everybody wants to pin positive, enduring qualities on Shakespeare far before, you know, they came into vogue, Caliban is not completely redeemed in this play, and it is relatively problematic the way that he is treated in terms of the lens of looking at it from a native perspective. There's no good reason to gloss over that, pretend it's not there, because pretending that history isn't the way that it was doesn't do us any favors going forward. So, I think it's important to keep in mind this outlook from, you know, the 1600s, and how far we've come as people. Okay. Questions to consider, you know these. How do you feel about the treatment of Ariel and of Caliban? What do they have in common, and how are they different? During a time when occultists were burned at the stake, what differentiates Prospero's magic from the weird sisters, from the witches in Macbeth? Think about that deeply. That's not like there's an answer to this. I'm promoting critical thinking, I suppose. And then, what about Miranda shows that she is different for not being a part of society? What qualities does she have? What could Shakespeare be saying about nature versus nurture, and that sort of thing? Again, we don't need to pin all of our best ideals on him. I'm not suggesting that, but something to think about. Okay, themes to examine. Talked about these. Freedom versus confinement. Loyalty versus treachery. Compassion and forgiveness. And nature versus nurture. And where do these show up? Where are they in juxtaposition to each other? Where are they put so closely next to each other that it's kind of hard to tell the difference between the two? All right, literary terms for the week. Our first one is allegory. Also, allegorical character. A literary work or character, or in which the characters or the events, etc., represent particular moral, religious, or political qualities or ideas. Particularly, like, think about in this play, and I keep saying allegory or allegorical character, obviously, because I want you to think about the characters this way. Not that I think that all of the characters are completely one-dimensional and all they exist as representations of only one thing, but as a layered character, what are some allegories that could be layered in there? There are, as we talked about, many theories that Shakespeare was talking about: colonialism, slavery, the nature of a person, learning, etc., that sort of thing. I also want to go back just a little bit. Shakespeare's day, they definitely had different opinions about slavery and everything like that. I'm not saying that Shakespeare was incapable of questioning those practices. It's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying we have to be careful not to put a modern lens on a 15th century man. Ooh, 16th century. Ooh, catch. Ooh. Anyway, second one, apostrophe. When a speaker is addressing someone who is not present or is dead, or speaks to an inanimate object, or an abstract idea, in such a way as if it were present and capable of understanding feelings. So, times when characters stand on stage and address something as if it were there, and it's not actually there, whether or not it's a character or an idea or that sort of thing. Apostrophe. Apostrophe. Okay, before we dive in, I know we're taking our sweet time. We're going to talk about romance as a genre. At the time The Tempest was written, the romance play was all the rage. And when we say romance, we don't mean the lovey-dovey kind that we think of today. We're not talking about Sleepless in Seattle here. The romance genre of Shakespeare's time was more like the fantasy or adventure genres of today. I think that's a better description. The stories they told were very complex. They were a mix of tragedy and comedy that was completely innovative at the time, resulting in big, heroic tales of redemption and forgiveness that call for magical worlds and magical characters. And the redemption and forgiveness is a very, very Christian aspect. The idea of divine forgiveness as something that is not earned, but given just the same. So, one way to describe a romance possibly could be as a tragedy played backwards. A common occurrence, I don't know what I was doing there, ignore me. A common occurrence in Shakespeare's romance plays, which I keep alluding to the others, there's Pericles, there's Cymbeline, and there's The Winter's Tale on top of The Tempest here. They all have happy endings that come from tragic beginnings. So that's what I mean by a tragedy in its reverse. Instead of a happy beginning that ends in a terrible ending, it's the reverse. It's a very sad beginning that has a good ending. For example, Hamlet, that we just studied. You know, it's a story of a brother's betrayal resulting in murder, and a son who can't reconcile the death of his father, resulting in more death, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, in The Tempest, we see a similar brotherly betrayal that starts the play off, but this one ends with reconciliation, and with the son reunited with his father when the son was presumed dead. So this play, like many of its same ilk, deals with estrangement and then togetherness, sin and forgiveness, repentance and, again, salvation. How many times can I say those words? And it does so while in this giant epic scope of the island, of wonder and of magic. Make sense? Cool. Okay, so Act 1. Scene 1, we begin in the storm. A common enough way to begin these plays. I know we've seen Twelfth Night had a storm in it. There are a number of other of Shakespeare's plays that have a very large storm in it, and people like to make jokes about that. But honestly, storms and ships getting lost at sea was a relatively common thing back then. Trading was primarily done by ship, and so a lot could be lost in a storm. So yeah. Anyway, so we got this crazy big beginning. How does it feel to jump into a performance so head on? Are you ready for it? You know, if you're sitting there in the audience and the lights go down and it's like, please turn off your cell phones. And then all of a sudden, boom, crash, pow, and you're in the middle of a storm. That's asking a lot, isn't it, to dive in so deeply all at once? How hard do you have to sell that as an actor, you know, to suck your audience in so immediately? Does it work? How did you feel? You were just reading it, but you got great active imaginations, I imagine. These sorts of things are the things I think about. Anyway, so King Alonso of Naples, and back then, we may have addressed this in the previous play, but before Italy was Italy, it was a bunch of city-states. So was Greece, so were a lot of places. So was Germany. They weren't these fully formed countries that we know today. They were individual states. So Naples in Italy was its own state. So Naples had its own king. So, anyway, King Alonso of Naples and his court are on this ship that's being tossed about in this giant storm. And despite the very best efforts of the boatswain, it appears to sink. All right. Play over, right? No! Act 1, Scene 2. We see Miranda and we see Prospero. Miranda runs up full of sympathy for the ship she sees sinking and begs her father, if you caused the storm, to have mercy because she suffered as she watched the ship suffer. And Prospero says, collect yourself. Get yourself together, girl. No more amazement. Tell your piteous heart, your compassionate heart, that there's no harm done. And then he explains. He explains to his daughter his history, which works as great exposition for us, right? Thank goodness he hadn't told her earlier, because otherwise we'd be in the dark. Anyway, he talks about how he once was, you know, the Duke of Milan. Yeah. The Duke of Milan. I'm sorry, I completely blanked for a second. It's written on the page, too. Goodness, Khaki. All right. So he was the former Duke of Milan, and for 12 years he's been stuck on this island because of his traitorous brother. Now imagine that you're Miranda, and you're learning this about your dad for the first time. You're like, what? It's been 12 years and you never bothered to tell me that I'm a princess? Amazing. Amazing. Anyway, his brother Antonio, so what we learn, at the same time as Miranda, in some ways we're a lot like Miranda in this play. You know, she's full of wonder and amazement and things she's never seen before. And so we can definitely relate to that. Except for we also get to see things from Prospero's point of view, because Prospero functions almost omnisciently, doesn't he? He's always watching. He's always orchestrating everything. So he functions as both the director and the audience of the play, while Miranda is the pure audience who doesn't know what to expect next. So anyway, his brother Antonio conspired with Alonso, the king of Naples, and usurped Prospero's dukedom, took it over. They put him and his daughter, put him and Miranda to sea, and the good Neapolitan being someone from Naples, Neapolitan, Gonzalo, set him up with his books that he loved so much, with food, with rich garments, etc., before they had to be sent off. They found the barren island that they're on now. They made it their home. And he says, here I have taught you better than you might have been taught in Milan, which is really interesting, right? Because he has all of this time to spend with his daughter because it's just the two of them. How much time would he have had for her if they had been back in Milan, you know? What kind of education as a woman would she have gotten? As a girl, probably not as much. So, another interesting look at nature versus nurture, what she was allowed to become, what she was allowed to accomplish because they were so far away from society. Anyway, she's like, thanks, appreciate it, but also, why did you cause the storm? And he's like, no, don't worry about it, go to sleep. So he puts her to sleep, you know, like you do when you're a dad, a magic dad, and he summons Ariel. So then, for the very first time, we get this airy spirit, A-R-Y-E, this airy spirit that appears. Ariel, the Little Mermaid, is named after Ariel from The Tempest, by the way. And Ariel talks about how he created the storm. He made the storm happen. Another little interesting side note, how Prospero says, I made the storm happen, but really it was Ariel who made the storm happen because Prospero told him to. So it's a little bit of, you'll see that throughout the play, Prospero taking credit for what Ariel does because Ariel is under his service. So it's like your boss always taking credit for what you do. It's 100% like that. Anyway, so Ariel reports on the Tempest, and says and quotes Ferdinand, telling him the story of how it went down because he was there while it was happening. That Ferdinand said, "Hell is empty and all the devils are here," which is one of the most quoted lines from this play. So I put it in here for you. So he said that he left the king's son on the beach, Ferdinand on the beach by himself as he was instructed. And Prospero was like, great, there's a whole bunch of other stuff I want you to do. And Ariel's like, do you remember that you promised me that you would free me from bondage? And this is officially, I guess, when we learn that Ariel is Prospero's slave. And Prospero, or he's like, I've served you well. I've done what you've asked. You said you'd free me. And Prospero is like, have you forgotten what I freed you from? Have you forgotten that you were trapped in a tree by the evil Sycorax? And Ariel's like, no, you've forgotten. And Prospero's like, yeah, you have. You totally forgot. She died, and she left you stuck in that tree, and you moaned, and you cried so loud that it sounded like the island was full of demons, and I was the one who freed you. And so Ariel's like, okay, yeah, you're right. Whatever. And Prospero says, okay, do everything I ask of you, and I will free you in 2 days. So Ariel's like, hot dog! Absolutely. What do you want? And Prospero says, I want you to become invisible. I want you to go and be invisible to everybody but me. Do it! Get going! So, we can already tell. He's got a plan. He's got a big old nefarious. He's got a big old plan. So, speaking of Ariel, here's some pictures just of some adaptations of Ariel throughout the years. This airy spirit, you know. Nifty, huh? Okay. So, next, Act 1, Scene 2, continued. The other half of it is Caliban, right? And so Prospero wakes his daughter up again and says, okay, cool, that's all done. Let's go visit my slave Caliban, even though he's never, ever, ever nice to us. He says mean things all the time. So now we've seen both of the enslaved people on the island. We've got Ariel, this airy spirit that Prospero, I don't know if you'd say he talks to him as an equal, but he doesn't. But there's a definite difference in the way that he talks to Caliban. And we learn that part of that is because Caliban is refusing to obey him. He is being very bad. And we learned that it wasn't always this way. Miranda calls Caliban a villain, you know. Prospero says he is, but he also, you know, does their menial tasks and everything, and so he's like, so we gotta keep him around, and so obviously they don't really like him very much. Why is this? Well, he demands Caliban to come out, and I'm jumping ahead of myself. He demands Caliban to come out of the cave. Caliban curses them. Prospero curses him back, curses that actually work, and draws Caliban out of the cave. So Caliban's like, this island is mine, as it was my mother Sycorax's. So we see Sycorax again from before, who trapped Ariel. And he says, when you guys first came here, you were kind to me. You taught me things to name the bigger light, the sun. The bigger light, taught him words, and I came to love you. I showed you all the qualities of the isle. Cursed be I that did that so. He's very angry at them, and Prospero calls him a liar. He's like, listen, things are great, and then you tried to defile my daughter. And that's when Prospero cast him down. And Miranda says, I pitied you. I was kind to you. I taught you to speak. I taught you something new every hour. Like, we hung out all the time, and I educated you. I tried to better you. But your vile nature could not be overcome with knowledge. Though you did learn, your vile nature, that phrase, was unchanged. And so you were confined to this rock. And Caliban says, yeah, I did try to molest you, and would that I succeeded, because I could have populated the whole island with Calibans. I think this is an even worse statement for us nowadays, but I think it definitely resonated back then too, him trying to force himself on poor Miranda, this vile-natured creature, this very, very base, follow your instincts kind of creature. He's given all of this knowledge, and his favorite thing to do with it is, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language, so you taught me all these things, and what it taught me to do is hate you, is a very summarized version of it. But again, nature versus nurture. Another interesting thing here is, how do you feel about Caliban? He's very much a conflicted, he's not conflicted. There are conflicting views on him. He's a confusing character to us, I feel. And he definitely fascinates people. Is he a villain here? Or is he a victim? Or is he both? Because unfortunately, you can be both. Here are some pictures of portrayals of Caliban. Just a few. There are obviously many. I particularly like the one in the giant shell. Okay. Act 1, Scene 2 is a very long scene, as you can tell. So now we see Ferdinand, and Ariel lures him with music and with singing, in order to bring him to Prospero and Miranda, as Prospero wanted. Miranda says, what is this, a spirit? She's never seen, aside from her father, she's never seen a human man before. No one her own age, she's just a teenage girl. And her father is an older man, so she's never seen a hot young teenage boy. And she says, I might call him a thing divine, for nothing natural I ever saw so noble. Like, whew, yeah, girl. Ferdinand, for his part, thinks that the beautiful music must have come because of her. He asks her if she's a maid. Are you single? Are you a virgin? And she says, yes. And he's not only overjoyed that her answer is yes, but that she speaks his tongue. She speaks English. This is amazing. Although, arguably, they're speaking Italian, technically. But not really, because Shakespeare did not write this play in Italian. Anyway, Prospero has his little aside, and he's really pleased that things are going well and that they like each other immediately. But he needs to make it difficult for them. He says, but this swift business I must uneasy make, lest too light winning make the prize light. Which is a great comment on the joy of the chase, right? Working towards something, making it better, making it more enjoyable, to earn it. that sort of thing, you know. In Cymbeline, another romance, there's a great line, the more delayed, delighted. So it's like our TV shows, right? If a guy and a girl immediately fall right in love with each other and there are no problems for them ever, it's not really that interesting. Whereas when you have a couple you've been waiting all season to get together, or even more than that, you know, it's when they finally do, it's that heightened feeling of finally, yes, you know. And so that's what Prospero is trying to create for them here, is like, no. We don't want to make it seem like it was not a big deal that they saw each other and they loved each other. We want to make it have gravitas, some weight to it, you know. Put some obstacles in their way. Make it challenging, make it worth it. So, with that in mind, he accuses Ferdinand of being a traitor. And he charms him in place, you know, when Ferdinand goes to fight him. And Miranda begs her father at this point to have mercy. Prospero says, you've only ever seen Caliban. What do you know? To other men, this guy here is as low as a Caliban. Which we know is not true. Because Ferdinand is a prince, you know, and within the play he acts like a prince, and he, anyway, doesn't matter, because Miranda says, my affections then are most humble. I have no ambition to see a godlier man, aka I don't care. I don't care if he's like Caliban, I want him, which is great, you know. It's like, instead of being like, oh, other girls won't think that my guy is cute, oh, well, I better shoot higher then. She's like, no. This one. Not to say that you shouldn't set your standards high, but anyway, I'm getting way off track on that. So, Prospero releases Ferdinand from the frozen enchantment, and Ferdinand says, fine, you know, imprison me for this, but let me see Miranda once a day, and that will be enough. Oh, very romantic. Oh, so cute. So Prospero then sort of, you know, reiterates that he's glad that it's going well. So obviously, these are the lovers of our play. These are the two lovebirds, the love interests, as it were. So when you think about all of the other sets of lovers that we've seen in the tragedies and the comedies and, you know, and all the different plays, which did you like the most? Now that we're coming to the end, and perhaps a fun exercise, I hope, is to think about characters in our own modern movies and TV shows and video games even that remind you of these different sets of lovers that we've seen. What tendencies stand the test of time when depicting love in a play or on stage or in media, I should say. What is still working for audience today, and what does that say about humans and the different ways that we express ourselves to each other? All right, finally, a new scene. Now, we have another group of island inhabitants, the newly stranded King Alonso and his court. And King Alonso is searching for his son, Ferdinand. And he's so sure that he's dead. Of course, we know he's not dead. We just saw him fall in love with a stranger. Gonzalo, the same loyal Gonzalo who sent Prospero and Miranda off with a number of very helpful things instead of just putting them in a boat and being like, bye. That's the same Gonzalo who's here. And he's trying to cheer him up, trying to cheer the king up. He says, oh, how fortunate it was that we survived. How many others are not so blessed in shipwrecks? You know, few in millions can speak like us to have survived. In the meantime, Antonio and Sebastian are complaining and bantering back and forth, disagreeing with everything that Gonzalo says. Gonzalo sees lush and lusty grass all around them, and Antonio and Sebastian see a horrible, uninhabited place. You know, optimist versus no, I said that right. Optimist versus pessimist. Kind of comparison here. One determined to see the best and make the best, and one determined to, or two determined to just have a bad time. Adrian comes down somewhere in the middle. You know, he's like, the island seems uninhabitable, yet the air is sweet. So, some really good descriptions we have here of the island. And the king is all but disinterested here. He's almost disinterested. I don't know. Interesting phrase. Anyway, caring only for his son. And then finally, when Gonzalo brings up the marriage to his daughter, you know, he's like, isn't it funny that our clothes are as nice as they were when we were marrying off your daughter? Which is something that Ariel did, you know. They should be gross and seawatery and everything, but they're not. They look good. They look sharp in their digs. But he brings up the marriage to his daughter, and Alonso finally snaps at him and says, you know, you are cramming words into my head against my will, against what I should be feeling. Stop talking about my daughter's wedding. You know, it's the worst thing I ever decided to do, because leaving the wedding, my son was lost at sea. And so was my daughter, for that matter, because she married an African. She married so far away. Thank you for cheering me up, bringing up all that stuff. And Francisco says, no, your son might still be alive, sir. I saw him beat the surge under him and ride upon the waves' backs. You know, his bold head above the contentious waves he kept his head above the water and swam with lusty strokes to the shore. I've no doubt that he came to land. That seems positive. That seems like a really good, you know, hopeful thought. And Alonso's just so depressed, just not buying it. And then Gonzalo starts talking about what he would do if he were king of the island. It talks about how there'd be no trade in money, there'd be no politicians, no schools, no rich, no poor, no slavery, no inheritance, no dividing up the land, nothing needing but careful cultivation and no work at all. You know, just idle, wholesome men and women living happily. And Sebastian and Antonio, you know, make snide remarks, and the king tells them all to shut up, and then Ariel comes along, this merry little band of misfits, and plays a song to lull them to sleep. So now everyone is asleep, which is something Prospero loves to do, make people just fall asleep in the middle of nowhere. I mean, the whole island is in the middle of nowhere, but you know what I mean. So now, when I say everyone, I mean everyone except for Alonso, Sebastian, and Antonio. But Alonso is very tired. And so Antonio and Sebastian agree that they'll keep watch while the king sleeps. And so the king then goes to sleep as well. And Antonio, treacherous, awful Antonio, who betrayed his brother, shows his wickedness again, because he suggests that Sebastian, who is the king's brother, kill his brother to become king. And Sebastian, you know, quibbles a little bit, asks if Antonio's conscience doesn't bother him for stealing his brother's title. And Antonio says that he's led by practicality, not by conscience. So eventually, Sebastian agrees, and the two agree that if Antonio draws his sword to kill the king, Sebastian will draw on Gonzalo. I think I got that right. Anyway, point is, they both decide they're going to kill these men for their own political gain. Right when that's about to happen, Ariel whispers in Gonzalo's ear, and wakes him up. And Gonzalo leaps up and wakes the king, and they all rise to find Antonio and Sebastian with their swords drawn. And, you know, obviously, they're all like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And they're like, oh my gosh, we heard lions. Crazy. And Alonso's like, oh my gosh, not lions. What? Really? We better all draw our swords. And so they decide to leave at once to find his son. So Ariel makes his little comments here and says that he'll be sure to tell Prospero about Sebastian and Antonio's wickedness, and that he'll help keep the king safe as he searches for the prince. All right. So now we have another group of people lost on this island. We have Trinculo and Stefano and Caliban. So Caliban is fetching wood, and he's cursing Prospero for the mean things that he does to Caliban all the time, like sending spirits to torment him while he works, and that sort of thing. And as Caliban is complaining of apes that chatter and bite him, hedgehogs that prick his feet, snakes that hiss him into madness, Trinculo enters, and Caliban assumes that he's another one of these demons come to torment him. So he decides to hide himself. Trinculo, who is a jester, a fool, we're familiar with fools, but it's up to you to tell me what kind he is. Definitely a drunkard. I ruined it, guys. I ruined it. He's a drunkard. He starts searching for cover because a storm is coming, and there's a lot of physical comedy in this scene. He spots Caliban, and saying that he's either man or he's fish or maybe he's both, he immediately thinks about how people in England would pay to see an odd thing like this. And then he decides that Caliban's deformed shape is simply that of a native islander recently hit by lightning. So he's just a weird dude. So anyway, hearing more thunder, Trinculo immediately jumps under Caliban's cape, seeking shelter. This is played out many different ways on stage, again with the physical comedy. Different things are used for the cape, like a blanket or whatever. Anyway. Then, Stefano, they're all drunkards, but the king of the drunkards in this play, the drunken butler anyway, wanders in singing dirty songs, like you do when you're a drunk servant, and he's surprised at seeing Caliban, seeing this four-legged creature, because Trinculo is under the cape. And Stefano announces that he did not escape drowning to fall to savages. So Caliban, thinking that Stefano is another one of Prospero's spirits, cries out again. It's like, what in the world is happening to me? This is awful. Stefano is shocked that the monster knows English, knows his language, and thinks that it has some sort of brain fever. Stefano decides to give him drink to ease him, but also hopes that he might drunkenly tame the monster and lure him back to Naples as a present for a European emperor. So Stefano makes Caliban drink the wine from his flask, and at the same time, the still scared and hiding Trinculo thinks that he recognizes Stefano's voice and calls out to him. After more physical comedy and nonsense, the two discover each other again, and Caliban realizes that they're not spirits, but decides that they must be gods, what with a drink that Stefano has offered him and has carried. Stefano doesn't deny it and claims that he was the man in the moon until he fell down recently. Fell down out of the moon. Caliban buys it because he's like, oh my gosh, I have seen the man in the moon. What? And boom, now he's promising to worship Stefano and be his servant instead of Prospero. Steadily drinking, he swears himself to his service and agrees to show him all the best parts of the island. And so Stefano and Trinculo drink, and they're sure that everybody else is dead. Just the two of them survived, right? With their wits. And so they're happy to be kings of the island, with Caliban as their only subject. I guess that's all it takes to be a king, is to have one subject. It's easy to be the man on the top of the hill when it's like this high. So anyway, Caliban's drunk now. And he's happy to be drunk. He's happy to be free of Prospero's rule, even though he's just agreed to be Stefano's servant. It's like a step sideways? I'm not sure. They're mean to him, certainly, but in a different way. At least there's liquor for him, I guess. Anyway. that is it for this week. Goodbye.